let me start with Wilson. Wilson, is this a perfect storm? The African Development Bank has said that if this is not managed well, it will lead to social unrest in the country, and we've seen that in the past few days. So how perfect is this storm?
Well, it's something of, grave concern. You know how food is, like we would say, it's when you've eaten that you can think of, doing other things. And so, we've had a case where in the last 13 months, so inflation at 29.9%, that's 13 months consecutive increase. Just before that, especially if you go back to the border closure that we had in 2019, we had, a case where inflation increased 19 consecutive months. Before that, we had the recession in 2016 where inflation increased 15 consecutive months. So we're seeing a case where in the last 9 years, inflation has been a big problem for Nigeria, and Nigerians have been through tough times. And we all know what that means, especially with regards to if you compare with household income or whether it's wages or even investment on the investment on returns aspect, you would see that Nigerians have been worse off. The fact that prices are increasing and your income is not increasing as much as it should means that people are falling into poverty. And my estimation is that by the time we reassess and even try to compute poverty numbers for say 2023, we would see that it would far exceed that 133 million multidimensionally poor Nigerians. So yes, it is a storm, and the consequences, would be grave if nothing is done to change the tide as far as increases in prices are concerned.
How important is it for this administration to get the macros right? Because if you see, like from what he said, there's been food insecurity in the north in the past 15 years, and we did not deal with it. Farmers have been paying harvest allowance to bandits. It's still ongoing. Farmers are being killed. They can't go back to their farms. Then cascade it into the economic crisis which we find ourselves. So how important is it for the fiscal authority to get the macro on track?
Oh, yeah, the macro is everything, because if you do not have that macroeconomic stability, in fact, it's almost like a precondition for the kind of, growth and expansion that we need, and the kind of production that can, say we can increase local production and even export more to other countries. All of this cannot happen if you keep having this sort of distortions and macroeconomic instability. So take FX, for instance. We can see how the rate has depreciated over time, and in fact, what we see now, within the manufacturing sector, which is also important as far as food is concerned, is that we've always argued that Nigeria is an import-dependent economy, right? But what you then see within manufacturing is that Nigeria has an import-dependent manufacturing industry. So when you look at some of the big players within the manufacturing industry, for instance, you would see that most of their inputs are imported. Just go through the books of maybe Nestle, Unilever, and some of these big players. You would see that in some cases, over about 58% of services materials are imported. You move to Unilever, something close to 65% or thereabout. So that in itself means that these businesses are heavily exposed to currency depreciation. They're also exposed to issues relating to the supply chain, the global supply chain. Whatever happens right now, we're talking about the Red Sea. Cocoa prices have gone to over 4,000, over $5,000 per ton. All of the issues we're seeing in the Red Sea. So it means that if you don't even produce, and by produce, I'm not even talking about finished goods itself. I'm talking about raw materials, goods that you would then need to produce other goods. Then you are, in a severe problem, especially because we've not had that stability in the last 8 years. We've had, series of, whether it's devaluation or depreciation. The other thing is that, so when you look at some of these firms, you would see that, for instance, things like wheat, sugar, industrial starch, are heavily imported into the country. And, I was speaking to a few manufacturers in November, last year, back in Nigeria. And some of the things that came up were that, look, they can't even produce as much as they want because of these problems of effects that they have. And you would see that just take an example with, say, cassava, for instance. Industrial starch is one of the things that many of these businesses need to as a byproduct of cassava. The demand for that is almost about, you see estimate at about 600,000 metric tons. you know Nigeria is the largest cassava producer in the world. But again, that industrial starch, over 40% of it is imported. So the question is, what stops us, from being able to process that cassava itself, to produce this industrial starch that is in heavy demand, and the demand is even forecasted to keep rising over time. So it means that we are not even, as far as if we look at the value chain of many of the agricultural products, or even within the manufacturing sector, you see that we are not tapping enough of those value chain. And that's part of why you see manufacturing is still 9% of our real GDP. It doesn't employ as much people because a lot of it has to do with importation of raw materials. And then that means businesses, therefore, are exposed to all of these macro instability, whether we talk about exchange rates and high inflation. You know,
Okay.
yeah, to conclude, I would say that, so when you look at what we trade in, you talked earlier about exports and imports. You would see that Nigeria is a net importer of agricultural products. We're a net importer of raw materials. We're a net importer of manufactured products. And these are, if you then look at data from the NBS, collectively, we're looking at an 11 trillion gap between import and export. So imports of these three areas: agriculture, raw materials, and manufactured goods. If you do the import minus export, you see that import is higher than export by 11 trillion. So my question is, my thesis is that we're not even producing enough for local production. How much more for exports? And the data shows it that manufacturing as a share of our export is just 2%, of what 2% of what we export are manufactured goods. I don't think any country, can make significant progress with that.
Wilson, let me stick with you a bit. What will be your recommendation to get us out of this macroeconomic challenge where we're in now? Because you said at the beginning, when I asked you a question earlier, that macro is it, and macroeconomic fundamentals are it. How far are you seeing these initiatives from the government in terms of the fiscal policy? Cardoso is trying to do on his side. There will be a monetary policy meeting next week to address inflation. I'm also wondering what you think about the stickiness of inflation and what that means for monetary policy meeting next week, Monday and Tuesday. The other part of the question which I want to ask you also is that of imports. The Minister of Agriculture has said that perhaps there will be a closure of borders. They are proposing closed borders. And where my mind went to was 2019, what President Buhari did, and he closed the borders. And if you take a look at it historically, that actually also worsened our economic situation. But how would you also analyze that? Do we need imports at this time, despite the Minister of Information and National Orientation saying that, I think he said that a few days ago, that we are not going to look at food imports? What do you think? Should we import food? Looking at it now economically, no political, just thinking economic terms now. Should we import food so that the prices will crash?
One of the things I would say is, first of all, the things that we should not do. And I think closure of the land borders is something that we should not even think of doing. If at all we want to learn from what has happened in the past in 2019. When the borders were shut, like I mentioned at the start of the interview, inflation increased consecutively for 19 months, right? So why would we want to go back? And when you look at the gains You can say we produced more rice, but even that rice is still being imported at the moment, right? When you then look at the quality, it's not as best as we would want that to be. So it then means that that's not actually what we should be doing. We should be thinking urgently to fix the value chain. We should be thinking of addressing insecurity. This should be like an existential threat to the country. We shouldn't be, trying to, call too many summits and meetings here and there. What the problems are very well known to Nigerians. If there's no security at the farms, people will not go to the farms to make investments. So focus on that. Another thing we should not do, is to start locking up shops for hoarding and all of that. You are basically sending a signal that people should not make the necessary investment that they should. So those are the two things that I think we should avoid as much as possible. The other, you talked about monetary policy meeting coming up, and of course, inflation is one of the key, target for the central bank, as the governor has mentioned, and they will be moving into an inflation targeting regime. I honestly think that going forward, one of the key things that the central bank should do, it should stop any lending to the government. I'm not even talking about, I'm talking about ways and means. And I know the statutory limit is 5% of previous year's revenue. But I'm saying at this point, just put a pause on it. Let's stop it and let the government think of how else it can raise revenue. 10 years ago, Nigeria was producing 2.1 million barrels of crude. Now we are producing 1.3 million barrels, on the average. And you're telling me that we won't have an exchange rate problem? We certainly would, because one of the major sources where we earn FX has dried up. So that in itself, shouldn't that qualify as an emergency for a country like Nigeria to address that and stop the theft? So let's not, and because what happens is anytime revenue drops, the next thing is to run to the central bank. And there's no way you could have injected 22.7 trillion naira ways and means into the economy within a very short time and not expect inflation to keep increasing. Even though I still think that there are many other factors, like I've mentioned, insecurity, the border closure and all of the supply chain bottlenecks, moving goods from one point to another, all of those checkpoints and co. Everything adds. But I think the central bank has its role to play. Stop any lending to the government at the moment, whether it's 5% or whether it's legitimate. Put a pause to that. If you then look at the data, what you find is that credit to the government and credit to the private sector, you would see that since 2018, credit to the government has grown faster than credit to the private sector. So we're talking about a growth rate of an average within 2018 and 2023. Credit to the government, has grown by 20% on average, by 47% on average, while credit to the private sector has grown by just 20%. So credit to the government has increased by almost like 12 times, from 2.9 trillion in 2015 to almost approaching 35 trillion. And then you can see that credit to the private sector is slowly growing. So an economy where lending is going more to the government, than to the private sector tells you something. It tells you that production is not happening. And that's where I then think that de-risking the value chain across many agricultural products is what we need to start, talking about at the moment. How can we start converting that cassava that we are, the world's largest producer of? How can we convert that into, sorbitol, industrial starch? And there is no shortcut to this. It's not something that would happen overnight. It's something that would require investment. We always think about long run is too long, but no, all of these problems could have been avoided if we had started doing the necessary things.
Okay, 5 minutes to the end of this program. What is the role of states in all of this? Aminu has spoken his mind and said that we need a Marshall Plan across all the crops that we are blessed across. He talked about being the highest producer of cassava. We are also the highest producer of yam, yet you'll be seeing Ghana yam abroad and all of that. So if we take specific crops, we can actually be net producers and also net exporters of these crops. What is the states, what are the states, what should the states do? What should the states do for this? Because so much attention is on the central. Now, President Tinubu is doing his. Vis-a-vis that the states are getting more money from FAC because of petrol subsidy removal, but there's still subsidy. That's another issue for another day. Wilson, we should not go into that. But they've been, in the last, from July of 2023 to December 2023, both states and local governments and FG have shared 3.3 trillion naira. So they have more nairas. What should be their involvement at this time?
I think, in terms of the role of state, I think their role is really critical as far as, building industries is concerned, developing value chains, because, again, people reside in the states. And we've seen that, many of these states have, incomes, their revenue has gone up significantly with FX and subsidy reforms. But I still don't think we're shining much light on them. Issues relating to how their resources are being allocated, in terms of even budgeting, where is the money going to, what areas are these monies going to, quarterly audits, in terms of what we see at the federal government level, where you have budget implementation reports and all of that. At the state level, it's very, very difficult to even get information as to where all of these resources are going to. So that's even one area that we need to even ask them more, as to, where are these monies going to. The other is in terms of, how they're able to support local businesses. Land issues, land tenures and co are very key as far as agriculture is concerned. What are they doing in terms of supporting local farmers? My colleague there, mentioned that, devaluation is actually an incentive for businesses to export to other countries. And whilst I spoke to a few, agri-business owners, in operating across maybe Ogun State and different parts of Nigeria, some of them, in fact, even said, one said that she even was surprised to see that her goods reached Russia. She sells spices and many other agricultural items. She was quite impressed that even as far as Russia, she could get her goods, were on the shelves. But one of the key problems that she also mentioned was that she's gaining a lot from exporting to other countries, but at the same time, because of the FX issues, she's also not really, there are issues with, being able to procure FX at, a very expensive rate. So that in itself erodes the gains that she's making. And then other issues relating to ease of doing business, which again, is not just a federal thing. State government role in terms of taxes, for instance.